1 second.
Uh, we are live, Harold. There you are.
There we
Okay.
are.
Hey, Prospect Weekly Roundup. It is August 2nd, 2024. It is, unless I miss my guess, 94 days, I believe, till the presidential election. Maybe 95. I don't know. Who's counting? I'm David Dayen. I'm the executive editor. With me today on the Roundup, we have Harold Meyerson, editor at large. Harold, how you doing?
I am doing well in the swamp that is Washington, and I mean that meteorologically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and figuratively as well.
Yes, yes.
So in 2 weeks, you and I will be together at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and we will see a ticket of unknown origin at this point. We know half the ticket. There is voting going on right now, I guess, in a one-man vote or one-woman vote for Kamala Harris. But she is going to pick a vice presidential nominee, and she's going to do it by Tuesday of next week when a barnstorming tour of all of the swing states is scheduled, and it's going to begin in Philadelphia, which is maybe, I believe, the biggest swing state, Pennsylvania. This has obviously led to speculation that the front runner for this position would be Josh Shapiro, who is the governor of Pennsylvania. I guess we'll start there. What are your thoughts around the possibility? I think at this point, you'd have to say it's a 50-50 shot between Shapiro and the rest of the field, maybe even far more than that. So what do you think about that?
Well, my first reaction is that Harris Shapiro sounds more like a law firm than it does a ticket. But once
I was at Harris Shapiro's bar mitzvah, I
There
think.
you go. There you go. But once we get beyond that, there are obvious strengths and obvious non-strengths that Josh Shapiro would bring to the ticket. The strengths are that he's very popular in the largest swing state, Pennsylvania.
Right.
He carried it by 15 percentage points over a very Trumpy Republican. He's only
Yeah.
been governor. He's only in his second year as governor, but he's made an impression in the spirit of Gretchen Whitmer's slogan, "Fix the damn roads." He kind of rose to
Right.
national prominence when I-95 briefly went down, and in the broadly speaking, the Philadelphia area, and he managed to coordinate a fix within almost like, less than 2 weeks, maybe just 1 week, which
Yeah.
was sort of remarkable. I don't think that fixing roads is necessarily, a task that the Constitution, ascribes to the vice president, but
Well,
it didn't
we
hurt his sort
just
of rollout to national consciousness. So
right.
he is clearly an articulate guy who has real strength in a swing state. And it's also, however, been the case that vice presidential candidates don't usually guarantee a result
Yeah.
in the state that
Yeah,
they come
I
from.
think people are overreading that, thinking that okay, you automatically slide Pennsylvania into the Democratic column if you pick the governor of Pennsylvania as the VP. That is not borne out by the admittedly scant evidence that we have. We haven't had that many presidential campaigns actually to make that determination. But
Right. I think
I will speak. Oh yeah,
the last time that may have happened was Lyndon Johnson uh,
giving Texas. Yeah, sure,
helping JFK win Texas in 1960. That was a long time ago. Uh,
indeed.
yeah.
I'll speak to a couple of these things. At the end of the 2022 campaign, which was Shapiro's campaign for governor, I was actually at his final campaign stop. It was at Bucks County Community College in Newtown, Pennsylvania, which is where my parents live. And there was a Fetterman Shapiro event there, and he's very impressive on the stump. Some say he has the Obama cadence down. You know, he's good at drawing contrasts in particular issues. Mastriano, who was the opponent in that gubernatorial race, was a complete non-starter. He was not just distasteful, sort of, and Trumpy to Democrats, but Republicans as well in the state of Pennsylvania. So the elevated number that he won by is in part due to that. I think Mastriano's fundraising collapsed at the end of that campaign. I don't put a whole lot of stock in how he outran the ticket, but he is, certainly a compelling speaker. The I-95 thing had personal resonance because the cutoff was actually it severed Philadelphia, Center City, Philadelphia, from Bucks County, which is where, once again, my parents are from. So it was an important span. I've been on that span many, 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 many times in my life. And the fact that they were able to get that done is great. I wrote this week about one aspect of policy that hasn't been getting very much attention. We've heard certainly about Shapiro's role with respect to Gaza, and particularly protests around Gaza at the University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere. I think my concerns there would be more free speech based than actually, the situation in the Middle East based, where he has said that Netanyahu is one of the worst presidents or prime ministers in the history of Israel, and that he supports the two-state solution. But what he has done with regard to the protests has been, a little interventionist and bad. There's also talk about, his position on school charters and vouchers for charter schools, which obviously isn't too compelling to the teachers union, which is a major part of Democratic politics. But I wrote specifically about his drive to accelerate the cuts in the corporate income tax in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had the largest corporate tax in the country. They made a deal before he got into office in 2022 to take that down over a decade from one of the largest at 9.99% to, among the smallest at 4.99%. And Shapiro wants to accelerate that, and instead of wait until 2031 to get to that number, to actually get to that number at 2026. I read some studies that show that reducing the corporate income tax usually is bad for inequality, because you're usually because especially in a state where you have to balance budgets, you end up increasing taxes elsewhere, and they're typically regressive. It does not seem to be the single linchpin that brings in businesses and around global or national competitiveness. The state with the largest corporate income tax is actually Minnesota. Minnesota has a lot of large businesses. It also has a governor who is also maybe in the running for this vice presidential nod in Tim Walz. And, quality of life, infrastructure, education, there are all sorts of reasons why companies relocate, and the tax situation isn't the sole determinant. And we need to get out of the mindset of the race to the bottom, where we just bring taxes lower and lower and lower. That's the way we do economic development. So that's what I wrote about with respect to Shapiro. And it's important because, there's going to be a big fight next year in Congress around taxes, including corporate taxes. And a lot of the same arguments being made by Shapiro are also made by business interests who say we have to be globally competitive and you can't raise the corporate income tax.
Although I don't think Shapiro would involve himself on the business side all that much. Were he vice president?
I don't either. But I think when you're talking about a political debate, they're going to use comments. Right. They're going to use statements. And if the vice president at that time, if he is indeed vice president, has these statements in his past, that's going to be used against the Democrats.
Right.
That's my point.
Two more points. On Gaza, I think the downside is not something that really affects public sentiment in the electorate at large, for whom our role in the Gaza war ranks very low among public
Right.
concerns. However, there's no doubt that it would more or less increase probably turnout and visibility of Gaza war protesters in Chicago at the time of the Democratic Convention. I don't know whether that's a factor in the Harris campaign's deliberations or not, but they certainly have to be aware of that. The other point I want to make just about Pennsylvania being a swing state, I think a lot of the key issue here is just how much turnout among African Americans in Philadelphia
Hmm.
the Harris campaign can generate. Because look, they're not going to be all that strong in Western Pennsylvania, except for the city of Pittsburgh itself. So I think that's really the key issue here. And I think that's really going to be more on Harris's plate than even if Shapiro is vice presidential
Right.
nominee, than his plate.
I want to talk about one other, and we actually have a question that came in from Jules asking what the impact will be in Michigan with Shapiro on the ticket. Well, obviously Michigan has a large Arab American population, and the uncommitted group in Michigan was fairly robust. And if Shapiro is perceived as strongly pro-Israel, that could play a factor. But I don't know it's the determining factor. I mean, this week, the head of the UAW, Sean Fain, announced the UAW's endorsement of Kamala Harris. I think that is probably somewhat more important than who the vice president is going to be. Although I should say that when Fain was asked point blank about vice presidential nominees, Shapiro was not at the top of his list. So maybe we should talk about a couple of the other nominees, including someone who was at the top of Sean Fain's list, and that's Andy Beshear. He is the current governor of Kentucky. And, I think based on what I'm hearing, if it's not going to be Shapiro, the most likely candidate would actually be Beshear. And I think what that would signal to me is that the Harris campaign is very comfortable making this election about the abortion issue. In 2023, last year, that's what Beshear did in his campaign. There's a very famous ad that he did with a woman named Hadley Duvall, who was raped by her stepfather at age 12. And she spoke directly to the camera to Beshear's opponent, saying the fact that you won't do exceptions for rape and incest is disgusting. And it's seen as maybe the most powerful ad of the last couple of years of the post-Dobbs era. And even Beshear credited that with winning the campaign. He won by 5 points in a state that Trump took by 26. And Harris actually 3 days before the debate appeared with Hadley Duvall on MSNBC on the second anniversary of the Dobbs decision. She's very comfortable talking about this. This is how she sort of regained her footing as a vice president, is going around the country talking about the Dobbs decision and reproductive rights. Beshear obviously understands the power of that argument and of that issue. And I think the two former law enforcement officers, Beshear was attorney general before he was governor, I think would be pretty powerful.
I think he's a twofer because he brings one other thing to the ticket that the other candidates don't, and that is youth. He's only 46 years old, and therefore he is more or less of J.D. Vance's generation, and he represents the state that J.D. Vance, was born in and wrote a great deal about, and I think would, really be an interesting contrast, particularly if they get to a debate at the vice presidential level. At the moment, we don't even know if there'll be a debate at the presidential level. I
Right.
think any number of the vice presidential possibilities we'll have a good line, as it were, on abortion. But yes, I mean, it is clear that Bashir really drove that issue home, perhaps more than anyone else, with the possible exception of Harris. But I also think, to a certain degree, by his youth, he also highlights the issue that the Republicans kept using against Biden, and that everybody eventually saw, which is Trump's age. This becomes really kind of a younger person's ticket if Bashir is on it. And obviously,
Right.
as governor of a state like Kentucky, he you know will project as somewhat of a moderate, which is probably something that the Harris campaign views as an asset as well. On the other hand,
Sure.
it's not clear that there are any southern states, even if she's, going to make an effort in North Carolina and Georgia. It's not clear to me that Bashir would be able to affect any of that.
Well, but once again, I mean, the role of the vice president in bringing states along is very
Right.
contested and tenuous. I think that Bashir can go into certain areas of battleground states that are rural and talk, with some authenticity. He is political royalty in Kentucky, by the way. His dad was also governor. Um, but getting to some of the things you talk about, I think also what Bashir does is he has led on some of the issues that we see Harris grouping together in a kind of freedom argument. So the very one of the very first things that Bashir did when he became governor was he gave about 180,000 formerly incarcerated individuals who are convicted of nonviolent offenses their voting rights back. He was extremely strong on vetoing an anti-trans bill in Kentucky, and talking about LGBT rights in Kentucky. Obviously, the abortion issue plays into that. So there's this whole freedom kind of argument, this nascent argument about the, sort of almost a libertarian or civil libertarian kind of get out of my life argument that I think he can credibly make. Now, a lot of the reasons I think he would present more moderate, in addition to being from state of Kentucky, is that his vetoes were overridden a bunch. So that anti-trans bill actually is law in Kentucky because the right-wing legislature there overrode the veto of Bashir. And so obviously being a Democratic governor in a state with a very Republican legislature, he doesn't have the track record of Gavin Newsom in terms of a policy record of things that he has passed, because he's just not in the position to get that stuff done.
And he certainly doesn't
Um,
have the record of Tim Walz, who is also certainly
right.
on the list.
So we should talk about him. Yeah. Let's go to Walls, and then we'll take this question that we got in the chat. So Walls, yeah. I mean, I think there's two arguments for his candidacy. Number one, he was in kind of the same position as a Harris administration will be in. And what I mean by that is that next year, if she wins, even if she gets a trifecta, it's going to be probably no more than 50 votes in the House. So the thinnest of majority in the Senate, I should say. So no more than the thinnest of the majorities, and probably a pretty thin majority in the House as well. When in 2022, in Walz's second term, he had a one-seat majority in the Minnesota Senate, I believe. And with this thinnest of majorities, there was a lot of sort of pent up need and desire for legislating in Minnesota over the previous years, where either there was a Republican governor or there was Republicans controlling one house of the legislature. And in 2023, he got done just a massive amount of stuff. And a lot of that stuff is the leftover Build Back Better agenda, right? So he passed family leave in the state of Minnesota. He passed a family, like a school lunch bill in Minnesota. He passed more money for long-term care and elder care and nursing homes in Minnesota. And so all of this stuff is actually going to be what the Harris presidency is going to try to pass in all likelihood. And Tim Walz did it
And
with a similarly thin majority.
And he also was able to enact some really groundbreaking labor legislation. This was the first state that, on First Amendment grounds, outlawed what are called captive audience meetings, which is what employers do when their workers are trying to organize a union. And employers routinely compel their employees to go to a meeting where an anti-union rant is delivered to them. Uh, I think there's 6 or 7 states that have gone along with this now, but Minnesota was the first.
Right.
And there's also been sort of a few versions of sectoral bargaining, which the state created.
Right.
So I
Particularly
think,
around nursing homes, I think. Yeah.
yes, exactly. So I think if you're looking for, a liberal, traditional Minnesota, vaguely social democratic running mate, Tim Walz is
Yeah.
definitely the one. He's
And let's say, like, this isn't just sort of liberal governor that you have to think about. Tim Walz was in the House for 12 years, and he was in a seat that was at best a toss-up seat, and more often than not a Republican leaning seat. Donald Trump won his district by 15 points in 2016, and he won that race. He won his House race despite that. And so a guy who was a frontliner, who has relationships in the House, and also has this very good record to point to as governor, makes for a good combination. And then the third thing, obviously, is that there's this weird audition process that goes on for vice presidencies now, and he's been good on TV. He created essentially this framing of Donald Trump and his cadres as weird, which now has gone to the highest echelons of the Democratic establishment. So there are a lot of reasons to argue for Walz.
There are indeed a lot of reasons. I suspect the limitations are that, again, with all the caveats about vice presidential nominees not really bringing a state with them, Minnesota is not really viewed as a swing state, and it's not clear if the Harris folks are looking for someone with a more moderate image, he probably does not top that particular list. Although, he's so middle American with a biography that, goes back to high school teaching, coaching, military, etc., that, he does not appear remotely to be, the kind of San Francisco liberal, quote
Yeah,
unquote.
and his
Yeah,
record in the House wasn't exactly that either.
right,
I mean, he was a pretty solid mainstream vote, I would
right,
say, in the
right.
House, but he certainly wasn't, AOC when he was representing a pretty swing district in the House of Representatives. So yeah, I don't think uh, that necessarily holds. He also happens to be the same age as Kamala Harris, although you wouldn't know it from looking at
Right,
the two of
right.
them.
He looks like much more of a gray-haired seasoned veteran.
Right.
Which whatever we may think of Kamala Harris, she doesn't look gray-haired.
Right, that is true. So there was a question in the chat from Jared that says, I wonder if any of the candidates might speak on the macro economy and corporate concentration more. He mentions Gina Raimondo, who he says is especially weak here. I don't think Gina Raimondo is really in the running for vice president for a variety of reasons. A couple of these candidates we've just talked about, Shapiro and Beshear, were governors, or were attorneys general as well, in addition to being governors. And in that capacity, they did work on, certain dealing with certain corporate malfactors, if you will. Beshear, in particular, did 9 lawsuits against the pharmaceutical industry over the opioid crisis, which was obviously very big in the state of Kentucky. He passed a law and signed a law that was based on an investigation he did as AG around pharmacy benefit managers, which are these middlemen that skim off the top of pharmaceutical transactions and is a very concentrated industry. So he has a pretty good track record there. And Shapiro actually has some of those attributes as well. So, you know, I think on that particular issue, I think there are some candidates that are good. Of course, we're still dealing with this whole flare up with Reid Hoffman and other oligarchs who are making these fairly outrageous demands on the presumptive nominee Kamala Harris to fire Lina Khan, the head of the Federal Trade Commission. Hoffman got into some trouble on CNN with Jake Tapper when Jake asked him point blank, "Is that how we should do politics in America, where you give a bunch of money and then you demand that somebody be fired?" And Hoffman said, "Well, you know, I was in my role as donor supporting Kamala Harris, and it was only in my role as expert if I was ever asked about Lina Khan would I give my opinion," as if he's like Clark Kent, where, you know, if he's wearing the glasses, he's for Kamala Harris, and if he's not wearing the glasses, he's a completely different person. And he in his non-glass wearing opinion thinks that Lina Khan should be fired. And I know you wrote about that a little bit this week.
Luke, you and I have all written about that to a degree. Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that because this is such sort of a blank slate presidency by the nature of the process, presidential candidate, the most since maybe Wilkie. We haven't known less about a candidate since 1940, or maybe Calvin Coolidge when he suddenly became president in 1923. But the fact of that has created a lot of this sort of projection, you know, where people decide they know who Kamala Harris is or wants to be, and they make those presumptions out loud. So there's this sort of battle, this contest for power going on right now.
Although we should point out that essentially what Reid Hoffman and also Barry Diller have been asking Harris to do is really dismantling some core policies of the Biden-Harris administration. It's not an easy ask, and it kind of goes, yeah. It kind of is almost asking her to repudiate the good stuff of the last 4 years. That's kind of an extraordinary ask, particularly when it's made in public. This is usually the kind of thing that you expect a major donor to say in private, because once you say it in public, it makes it, you know, very, very hard for the politician you're trying to influence to go ahead and do it. Then you look like you're a bought entity.
100%. And not only that, but they are trying to get Harris to block someone who is investigating them or their companies. Reid Hoffman has invested in a company called Inflection AI that was essentially, you know, acquired by Microsoft, but they did it in such a way to avoid the antitrust laws. Basically, everyone at Inflection AI quit and then was suddenly hired by Microsoft the next day. And this is the get around, you know, the merger policy, and the FTC is actually investigating that right now. And Reid Hoffman, I should say, is on the board of Microsoft. LinkedIn was bought by Microsoft, and they gave him a board seat. And he's also invested in Inflection AI. So and with Barry Diller, also, it's been reported that several of the companies as part of his conglomerate, AIC or IAC, are being investigated by the FTC. So this is like, you know, going to the chief of police and say, "Hey, can you get your cop? Here's a $7 million. Can you get your cop to take a walk while I do my business?" That's that transactional nature of this makes it even seedier. So, all right. Well, I think we've rightly covered that, and we will continue to do so at prospect.org. I invite you to continue to hand over your questions for us. But we will segue into maybe more of a foreign policy thing. We've seen a couple of foreign policy.
Well, we haven't discussed,
Oh,
I think we need to discuss Senator Kelly on the vice
oh,
president.
okay, okay. If we want to
Yeah,
finish that up, we
yeah.
can discuss
I
Senator
mean,
Kelly. So,
it's pretty, on the one hand, if they see that the border and immigration is
yeah,
their chief obstacle or their number two obstacle to winning the election. The thought is that Kelly has this on the ground experience and therefore more nuanced perspective and can, take some of the heat off of them. On the other hand, having been one of only three Democratic senators, including two who since became independents, Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, not to back the newer version of Labor's Magna Carta, the PRO Act. The unions
yeah.
have come out very strongly against him, so much so that he actually announced within the last week that, okay, now I'm for the PRO Act. But, the fact
A
that the
deathbed
unions,
conversion. Yes, a
yes,
deathbed
yes,
conversion. Yeah.
indeed. The fact that the unions are so dead set against him, I think, is a big strike.
Yeah, I think it would be difficult. Now, I'm sure you've talked to labor leaders, and I've talked to labor leaders about this. One thing I've also heard, I mean, Kelly has an incredible biography. He's been to space. He was a fighter pilot. His brother is an identical twin who's also been to space. And
And
the
he's
other
married
thing
to
is
Gabby
that he's
Gifford, so
exactly,
can
and
certainly talk about gun
speak
control.
on the guns issue. And one thing I've heard is that if Kelly were to be the pick and he becomes vice president, there would obviously be a vacancy in that seat in Arizona. Arizona has a Democratic governor, Katie Hobbs, and it would be very likely that she would pick Giffords to be the uh, uh, the senator from Arizona for that 2 year period. I don't know if she would continue on after that, but it would certainly be the case, and that would be pretty powerful as well, of course. So, I mean, I think there certainly are reasons that you would look at a Mark Kelly and say, yeah, this could be the guy. But the labor stuff, certainly you and I both heard that's going to be a difficult obstacle because it wasn't just the PRO Act, right? He was instrumental in preventing David Weil from getting a nominate or confirmed to the position of the Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor. The reason that Julie Su is now still, for the last 2 years, I think, the acting labor secretary has a lot to do with reticence from people like Mark Kelly to agree to vote for her. So, I think it's not just one thing, like not
Right.
just voting on the PRO Act. There's sort of a history there. He's also served as some boards of gig companies and restaurant chains and things like that. That I think people look at suspiciously.
You have anything you want to say about Pete Buttigieg?
Yeah, I mean, I think now we're getting into people that I don't think are likely to
Right,
be the
right.
nominee. So, I mean, Buttigieg, I frankly have had somewhat of a change of heart on Buttigieg. I think, and it's not because he goes on Fox News and gives them the what for. Like, I don't really care about that, but he actually has been a workhorse in addition to a show horse. He wasn't in his maybe first year or two at the Department of Transportation, but he has in the last year or so, I would say, shown a real willingness to take on the entrenched transportation interests in this country, particularly at the airlines,
Right.
with major fines, major enforcement, and new rules that really protect the public over these large corporate interests. So,
Yeah.
I think that's been a positive for Buttigieg, and hopefully he will remain involved in the administration in some capacity in the next term.
Airlines, of course, are such a target-rich environment. I mean,
Right.
it's been transportation secretary should have been going after them for decades. But it's been great to see Buttigieg doing it in the last year. I think there might be some calculation that two members coming out of the Biden administration, not just one, doesn't create a kind of at least conceptual diversity that getting a governor or a senator would. So I think that
Right. It would be hard to also distance from the parts of the record that you want to
exactly,
distance from. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that I agree with that. Okay. So, yeah, I was going to segue here into a couple of foreign policy things. Obviously, there was fairly dramatic news yesterday with a journalist from the Wall Street Journal, Evan Gershkovich, along with several other individuals who were held captive in Russian prisons, were traded in a very dramatic multi-country set of deals that also released a lot of Russian prisoners back to Russia. All of this was apparently being done while President Biden was deliberating over whether or not to stay in the race. In fact, he was continuing to work on this within the hour that he released his statement that he would drop out. I think it's a real diplomatic victory for Biden, and shows that what these final several months of his presidency might look like, with him trying to cement a legacy and make real gains, probably most of them being on the world stage.
And I would say it kind of weakens the Republican talking point, which wasn't ever going to be more than a talking point, but that he's not really capable of being president. I mean, I think this was
Right.
one added incentive. While I'm bowing out, damn it, I'm going to show I am capable of being
Right.
president, and certainly did that. And also, it should be pointed out that he worked this out in conjunction with a whole number of nations where Russian prisoners were behind bars, and most particularly Germany, because the person that Putin wanted back the most was a convicted hitman who was doing time in Germany. And so Biden had to work this out with Olaf Scholz. And I think in a abstract way that really doesn't matter in real world politics, it demonstrates the importance of having allies and good
Right.
relationships with them, which a certain Republican presidential nominee poo-poos.
Absolutely. I do want to go back because we got a comment in the chat, and it's more back on Mark Kelly, and it says, will be interesting to see how Kelly votes on the Manchin-Barrasso energy bill, especially for environmentalists. I'll explain briefly what that is. There was a deal struck between Joe Manchin, and Senator Barrasso around permitting. John Barrasso it is, but by the way, it's around permitting reforms, which is a very Washington compromise that trades reforms to clean energy projects to help get them off the ground, particularly transmission lines. Makes it much easier to get transmission lines built in exchange for loosening the reins on some fossil fuel energy projects, and helping them continue to get built. So my view is that there's not going to be a vote on this bill, at least not in the short term. And the reason is that both sides have an interest in waiting to see what the next Congress is going to look like. If you're Chuck Schumer and you see this bill that has a lot of dirty energy in it, and you might get a full trifecta next year without Joe Manchin in the Senate, you might be thinking, well, I can probably get a better version of this next year. And likewise, if you're Mike Johnson and you have the belief that you're actually going to win your own trifecta and win Congress as well as the presidency next year, you also probably think I'm going to get a better version of this next year. And so maybe in the lame duck session, depending on the outcome of the election, you could see a vote on this, but I very highly doubt that you're going to see it beforehand. So wipe that aside. And the other thing, and I want to get your thoughts on this, I know you've been talking to some people inside Israel. Obviously, this week, we had the assassination of the political leader of Hamas while he was in Tehran, attending the inauguration of their new president. This, in addition to the strike on a Hezbollah leader in Lebanon, the fact that this was also in Iran, it wasn't just a Hamas leader, it was done in Iran, where they had jerry-rigged a particular safe house with a bomb. This has the potential of sparking a wider war. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts on, what that portends.
Well, I mean, A, it certainly does, and B, so what was Bibi thinking? Uh, you know, uh, the, he they eliminated the guy wasn't just a Hamas leader, he was also the lead negotiator. And in a
Of the
sense,
ceasefire. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
for a ceasefire. And so in a sense, this also blows up future negotiations for a ceasefire. Who's going to show up on the Hamas side?
Yeah.
Given what happened to this guy, and this
You
gets
call
back
it a
to,
credible partner at the negotiating
yes,
table. That credible
exactly.
partner now has a gun planted at your head
Yeah,
and killed the
exactly.
last guy. Yeah.
And this gets to the fact that I don't think Bibi can envision a post-war Israel in which he is still prime minister. And this prolongs the war. This really ends whatever prospects there may have been in the near and midterm for a ceasefire. And I think the only way that this could be brought about at this point is if the administration took a position which it is yet to take, which is only saying no more offensive weapons to Israel. However, if there is a wider war, particularly if there is direct Iranian
Mhm.
involvement, as there had not been except for the spate of missile attacks,
Right.
which essentially was the U.S. and other allies worked together to create even more of an iron dome over Israel. Bibi may also be hoping that America gets more implicated in the war, which would be a huge political problem here as well as there. You have to assume, by the way, within Israel, that the families of the hostages are really, who were already completely estranged from the Netanyahu government, are even more so because
Yeah.
this was really an attack on any settlement that brings the hostages back. I mean, uh, you can never say in this context that we've seen the worst. It always can get worse. And, unfortunately, I think Netanyahu thinks that, if a settlement is finally reached, his claim on office is going to be very weak. And so that's
Right.
what
I
I'm
mean,
saying.
it's hard to come up with a parallel for that,
Yeah.
right? Where someone's usually the head of state wants to get to a situation of peace, right?
Yeah.
That's what will be popular. But the personal interests of Netanyahu have well outshone any kind of political interests and particularly in the case of the hostages, in getting a reunion of some point done. That is because of that dynamic, which I can't think of another instance where a wartime leader wants to prolong the war for its own political expediency. That seems to be a very intractable situation for the world.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I think what this should do is put more pressure on the Biden administration, which is already working, around the clock just to try to keep this thing from exploding into a wider war. To also say, okay, enough with the offensive weapons. Look where this is getting us. No more. We understand you need to cling to power through keeping the war going. that is not the policy of the American government.
Right, and it's also not a policy that is good for Israeli security,
No,
right?
it's only good for Bibi security. Then this is
Indeed.
l'état c'est moi, and only in wartime. You know.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, that gets back to this idea of Biden now being a lame duck. So, I mean, Biden's entire 50 plus year history, as we've written about, is tied up with Zionism, with unflagging support for Israel. He's displayed that during this nearly year-long war, but he is coming to the end of his political career, and it must, at some level, weigh on him that if he goes out having uh, enabled or failed to prevent the conflagration that is going to incinerate the Middle East, that would be really damaging to his entire project of seeing himself as the world's foremost entity on foreign policy.
Yeah. It also just occurred to me to link this to our initial part of the discussion that if he does finally do what he needs to do and cuts off the flow of offensive weapons to Israel, uh, picking Shapiro as your vice president at least makes clear that yes, you want to do this, but we're really not. We're really pro-Jewish here. If anyone wants to raise that issue, of
Right.
course, Trump recently said he didn't think that Harris likes Jews. Of course, she is married to one, and I can only imagine he'd double down if not only is she's married to one, but has one as her running mate. So anyway,
Yeah. Well, he also doesn't think she's black, but
right, right,
um,
right.
but anyway, I mean, you know, I have talked about this on other programs, and maybe I talked about it here. That and I your insight on this would be good. The situation that Harris finds herself in right now, the analog is what Humphrey found himself in 1968. Right? There is a foreign policy now. Obviously, the Vietnam War was a much broader of much broader interest to the entire public, especially because there were American troops there,
Yeah, and especially because there was
than
a draft.
Gaza.
Yes,
And
they
there
were
was a draft.
drafted
Yeah,
to go
I
there.
mean
There were very
they're
few
not
volunteers who went to Vietnam.
they're not analogous situations,
Yeah.
but given the small margins of this election and how there is a vocal minority of people that do really care about this. So Humphrey was trying to break with the policies of his own administration and finding it difficult to do that until the very end of the 1968 election. Harris is, while rhetorically sort of showing more sympathy towards Palestinians, is in the same boat. She is at pains to break with the policies of her own administration. And if there is daylight for Biden to actually make that break, it frees Harris up to do the same thing.
And Humphrey, going back to 68, was really afraid of Johnson, pulling all kinds of behind the scenes support he was giving Humphrey if he broke with Johnson. And it was not until I think the
Right.
first or second week of October in 68 when Humphrey finally did and delivered a speech. And he was trailing Nixon at that point by about 12 points. And after that, his polling rose steadily, and he only lost in terms of the popular vote by
Yeah.
about 1% to Nixon. So,
I know
uh,
I've heard in history books, like if he came out a week earlier,
yeah,
that
yeah,
it would have had enough momentum to actually put him past Nixon.
yeah. I think in since I was a political junkie at age 18 in 1968, that was a perception then too, that he was late, and that it was
Mm-hmm.
long
Mm-hmm.
overdue, and at least he did it, which is what essentially made it a competitive race.
Right. And so for Harris, she's kind of, I mean, I think the situation is a little different because Johnson really still was a power broker in the Democratic Party, to the extent that Biden, if he was before, I think the circumstances of the past month has reduced his power significantly. And
I would also
yeah,
add that, most, the mainstream of the Democratic Party is not wildly supportive of our continuing to give
right,
offensive arms to Israel, whereas there was a real rift in '68 among
right,
Democrats, and it was not just from the
right.
outside demonstrators, but within the convention hall, where I'm going to do a little visual aid here. I was in the
Okay.
convention hall. This is my floor pass to the third
Ah,
night of the 1968 Democratic Convention. I
there
was
it
an
is.
18-year-old kid working on Gene McCarthy's staff.
Right.
There were real differences about the Vietnam War, and I think right now the Democratic base would be relieved at this juncture if we cut off offensive weapons to Israel.
Right. The question is, does Harris feel that she can call for that in the context of where we are now before Biden?
Exactly.
I don't know that she feels confident enough that she could actually do that.
Yeah, I think it's such a signature position of the administration that he has to go first.
Right. So we'll see if we'll see if he does that. Of course, you mentioned with your floor pass, you will once again be on, maybe not the floor, but inside the arena. 56 years later, in the same city. And I think one thing that is clear is that there may not be as many protesters outside the arena, but there certainly will be some.
Right.
Now, every presidential convention that I've been to has had its share of protesters, but there has been innovations in kettling over the last several years that has moved and shunted aside those protesters to a very small pen that is far, far away from any delegates or the prying eyes of the news media. It's a good question as to whether that will also hold in Chicago, where there's a progressive governor, mayor, I should say, that probably isn't going to wield the police force in the same way that they did in 1968. You've written about this a little bit previously. What do you think that's going to look like, especially now that the head of state who was responsible for the policy is not going to be the nominee?
Right. Well, it's not going to be like 1968, just because the intensity and the breadth of opposition to the Vietnam War clearly dwarfs that of the critics of the Gaza War. I would also point out in '68, the demonstrations and the place where the police riot, as it was later termed by a governmental commission, occurred wasn't anywhere near the convention hall either. However, it was right in Grant Park, which is where every media outlet had its convention headquarters. And so, as the demonstrators chanted as they were getting the crap beat out of them by the cops, the whole world is watching, and it was. And they were split
Mm-hmm.
screen television on television. You saw the riot, the police running amok on one half of the screen, and people nominating Hubert Humphrey on the other half of the screen.
Right.
So, neither what we see in the hall nor what we see on the street, I think, is going to quite rise to the level of conflict that we saw in '68. But again, it is an issue, and in the broader sense, as you have just said, it's really only for Biden to begin to diffuse it, and Harris has to defer to him on that.
Right. Um, Yeah, I mean, there is going to be at least a small contingent of delegates who are, in fact, uncommitted. This week, they formally asked for a speaking slot at the convention. I doubt that they will get one, although they are certainly a part of the party, and maybe they should. Yeah, go ahead.
In '68, there was a huge platform fight. We don't, we think of '68 as what's gone on outside the hall, and well, we overlook the conflict inside the hall. About a third
Right.
of the delegates there had been pledged to Bobby Kennedy, who,
Hmm.
had been killed, or Gene McCarthy, or even if they weren't pledged, that was where they were determined to be. And
Right.
there was a bitter fight over the platform in which the anti-war forces made very good, I thought, because that was the night I was in the hall, presentations. They were led by Phil Burton, the great San Francisco congressman, who is responsible for the rise of virtually every San Francisco political leader to the national stage since. So I
Not
don't think
Kamala.
not not Kamala, but he is responsible for the rise of Willie Brown. We won't go into this, but
Right. Right. Okay.
yes, Willie Brown was a young member of the Burton machine. So anyway,
Right.
we're not going to see that level of internal conflict inside the hall as we did in
No,
60.
mainly because the platform doesn't happen in the hall anymore.
Yeah.
It happens off site. It happens in other sessions, and it may be done well before we get to Chicago at all. Maybe,
But
yeah,
you still have to adopt the platform, and so that
you have to
creates a
adopt
forum
it.
for debate.
Yeah, but I
That's
mean,
what the debate is.
allegedly it creates a forum for debate. I
Yes,
think in
yes.
reality, I don't see that it has. There have been divisive issues that have gone through before in prior uh, uh, campaigns, and I've seen them gabbled through very quickly and quietly. These
Well,
things are
Hubert Humphrey is
infomercials
at the
now.
center of the two great platform fights. First, for
Right,
civil rights in 48, which was a huge historic
right,
departure from the Democratic Party's past, and then, of course, 68.
right. Absolutely. All right. Well, we have a couple minutes left. Wondering if there's anything else you want to tell our readers about that you're looking at in the coming days.
Well, just I'll be writing about this. I'll be writing about the Middle East, and I was already going to, the column I'm writing for Monday is
Hmm.
Bibi's Mideast solution: perpetual war. So
Right.
I'm following that was
Yeah.
already determined before we had this discussion. But
Right.
certainly that, and then just looking forward to the Democratic convention, and obviously all of us will be writing something about the vice presidential pick, which has to be done before or no later
Yeah.
than Tuesday.
Well, let me tell you about our coverage at the convention. We're going to have four different writers, actually five, I should say, because Rick Perlstein lives in Chicago. We have five different writers on the ground uh, at the convention. We will be on the floor or in the hall. We will be all around the city and taking in the events, talking to lawmakers, policymakers, people, probably just bystanders and people, that there to express themselves on a particular issue. So you go to prospect.org every day during the convention. We're going to have a lot to bring you that hopefully will be a little bit more than what you would see on television. So we're excited about that. And we will, of course, be here every Friday at 12:30 Eastern for the weekly roundup. Also, I should say you should subscribe to our newsletters. Harold and Bob do On Tap every week, every day of every weekday. Bob Kuttner, I should say, and as well as Harold Meyerson. You can go to prospect.org/newsletter to pick up a copy of our newsletters, and that those are some of the only ones, but maybe we'll do even more around the election.
And
So it should be exciting.
just by going to prospect.org, you can read David Dayen almost every day. Since you're
There
such
you
an
go.
inveterate reporter, writer, analyst, etc.
There you have it. Well, thank you, Harold. Thanks for being here today, and we will see you all next Friday, same bat time, same bat channel. Thanks a lot. See you.
Bye.